Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's lecture. My name is Benjamin Rifkin. I'm Professor of Russian and Dean of Hofstra College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Donald J. Sutherland Lecture. It's named for a former trustee of Hofstra University who endowed this event, which is annually sponsored by Hofstra College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. The Sutherland Lecture is designed to bring to Hofstra's campus an outstanding speaker in one of the fields of the liberal arts and sciences, or an outstanding artist in one of the finer performing arts. The goal is to invite individuals whose presence on campus and whose participation in a lecture or performance will significantly enrich both our students and our faculty. The lecture is endowed by a first gift in '98 and a second one in 2003 from Donald J. Sutherland, who was a trustee of Hofstra University. Mr. Sutherland started Quincy Associates in 1970 and with other investors, including Credit Suisse and the Hillman Company, took the lead in buying 18 companies. The firm became Quincy Partners in 1975. Mr. Sutherland graduated from Princeton University in 1953 and received an MBA from Harvard in 1958. He served in the Navy for 3 years. In 1970, he started Quincy Associates. And from 1985 to 1987, he was president of the Joffrey Ballet. Not only a trustee of Hofstra University, but he also became a trustee of the Joffrey Ballet and a governor of the New School for Social Research. Previous Sutherland Lecture speakers have included the poet Robert Pinsky, novelist Salman Rushdie, presidential biographer Robert Caro, historian Deborah Lipstadt, urban affairs specialist Fred Siegel, and Governor Mario Cuomo. The most recent Sutherland lecturers have included journalist Bret Stephens of the New York Times, journalist John Podhoretz of Commentary Magazine, former US Senator Joe Lieberman, General Barry McCaffrey, retired, law professor Philip Hamburger of Columbia University, law professor Ilya Soman of George Mason University, journalist Max Boot of the Washington Post, and law professor Joe Goldstein of the St. Louis University School of Law. So this is a very prestigious lecture, and we're very grateful for our former trustee for having endowed it. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce my colleague who will introduce our Sutherland lecturer today. Dr. Constantine Alexandrakis is Associate Professor of Economics at Hofstra University. He joined Hofstra in 2008, holds a BA in economics from the University of Piraeus and master's and PhD in economics from Clark University. Prior to joining the Hofstra Pride, he taught economics at the University of Massachusetts Dartmouth and Emory University. His main interests lie in the fields of macroeconomics, economic growth, and public economics. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Alexandrakis to make the introduction and to begin our Sutherland lecture today.
Now I'm unmuted. Yes, okay, good. So thank you, Dean Rifkin. Welcome, everyone. It is both an honor and a pleasure to introduce Dr. Gregory Mankiw. Dr. Mankiw is Robert M. Beren Professor of Economics at Harvard University. He holds an undergraduate degree in economics from Princeton University and a PhD in economics from MIT. From 2003 to 2005, Dr. Mankiw served as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors of President George W. Bush. He has important scholarly contributions in the fields of economic growth, public finance, and monetary economics, and is the author of 2 of the most popular textbooks in economics, one in Principles of Economics and the other one in Macroeconomics. And Dr. Mankiw also finds time to maintain his own blog. Greg, I wish I could welcome you in person on campus, but thank you for joining us on Zoom.
Oh, thank you very much. It's a great honor to be with you.
Very good. So the procedure will be as follows. We'll spend some time talking on various issues, and people can send questions through chat. My colleague, Professor Robert Gottman, will be collecting those questions and posing them to Dr. Mankiw whenever he sees fit. Most of them, I guess, at the end of our interview, and he will be monitoring through the chat room. So, so I guess it's inevitable that the first question would be on the current situation and the pandemic. That's what a lot of people want to know, what's going on. The issue is that prior to the pandemic, I think by most economists' account, the economy was doing very well. The unemployment rate was the lowest rate that we have seen in decades at 3.5%. Inflation was close to the Fed's target of about 2%. Median earnings were rising at one of the highest rates we've seen in decades. And all that was destroyed by the pandemic. We went to near Great Depression levels. So the question is, will we return once the situation, maybe once we have a treatment, will we return back to those short-lived good times, or are these times gone forever?
You're absolutely right that the economy was doing great prior to the pandemic. Everything looked terrific. People can debate, the causes of that, but there was no question the economy was in very good shape. In fact, I wrote a column shortly before the pandemic saying how Donald Trump was in a good position to get reelected based on all the economic indicators available in January. Obviously, things quickly changed thereafter. Then we saw this downturn driven by the COVID disease, and it gave us a very unusual recession. I mean, the decline from February to April was the fastest decline we've ever seen in the economy. The second quarter growth rate of GDP was the biggest negative number we've ever seen since the quarterly data goes back to World War II. And then conversely, the third quarter that we just got, I think today, or maybe it was yesterday, is the fastest positive number we've ever seen. So we saw an incredibly fast decline, tremendously fast recovery. We still haven't fully recovered. I'd say we've probably recovered 3/4 of the decline. So we're still well below potential. Unemployment is still high. So we're not back to normal, but we have seen, quite a rapid comeback. The question is what's going to look like going forward. Early on, if you look at the forecasts back in March, they're put out by the health forecasts put out by a group like the University of Washington Medical Group. They thought that by summer, the pandemic would be largely behind us. They had really cases going down to zero by midsummer. Because they thought that we would put enough social distancing in place, enough testing and contact tracing in place that could really keep a lid on this. At that point, I think there's good reason to be optimistic about the recession, because I think to a large extent, the macroeconomy is being driven by the microbiology. So whatever happens in the health sphere is going to drive what's going on with the macroeconomy. So at the time, I was reasonably optimistic early on, based on those health projections. If you look at the unemployment, obviously unemployment had gone way up, but it was an unusual form of unemployment. It was mainly people on temporary layoff. People had jobs, or basically told them, sorry, jobs disappeared temporarily, but don't worry, you still have a job here. You're just on temporary layoff, and therefore you can come back. With a normal recession, you see increases in permanent job losses, and we hadn't early on seen much permanent job losses. But as this drags on, those temporary layoffs can easily turn into permanent job losses as some of these small firms struggle and maybe even go out of business. So I think if you compare where we were in, say, April, May to where we are today, I think we've gotten sort of bad news. This health problem is dragging on longer than it looked like it was going to, and as a result, the economic costs are going to drag on farther. So I don't think we really know the answer, because we haven't really experienced this. But my guess is going forward, the pace of recovery is going to slow way down from what it was in the third quarter. I think the fourth quarter will probably see continued recovery, but at a much slower pace. And then certain industries are just not going to see recovery until people feel safe. I mean, it's not just the shutdowns. I mean, there's certain industries that people just don't want to, consumers don't want to go to. Like, I love eating out at restaurants, but I haven't sat down inside a restaurant. I've got some outdoor restaurants, but I haven't sat inside a restaurant since February. I used to do a lot of business travel, giving talks, like I was going to talk at Hofstra last spring. Oh, and I'm not getting on an airplane anytime soon. I haven't been on an airplane since February. I can't, it may well be another year or two before I'm willing to get on an airplane. So certain industries like the airline industry, the restaurant industry, they're going to, I think, suffer for a long time. And some of those temporary layoffs are going to turn into permanent job losses, which means the rest of the recovery may be slower, look more like a normal recession, as opposed to the very rapid growth we saw in the third quarter of this year.
So that's interesting, and that brings up a follow-up question that if this medical solution does not come quickly, what does this mean then about, should we expect a wave of bankruptcies? Because that's, I think, the other concern, right? That a lot of businesses are now borrowing to stay afloat, they're burning through cash, but how long can they continue to do that? And then if what does this mean about the recovery going forward, even if, let's say, a vaccine were to become available?
Yeah, if a vaccine is great, if it's very effective, and we get a lot of people taking it, then you can imagine a relatively rapid recovery. It's also very plausible that they'll have a vaccine that's 50% effective, will still be approved at 50% efficacy, and if only half the people take it, then this thing's not going to be behind us. It will be better, but it'll linger. We'll still have to do social distancing. People like me are still going to be nervous about sitting down inside a restaurant or inside a movie theater. I have a nice 60-inch TV. I don't need to sit inside a movie theater. I'm happy to stream movies, even if it's not the most recent ones. So I think a lot of these businesses are probably going to go bankrupt. Some of these are probably things that may need to go bankrupt anyway, like movie theaters. I mean, there's been a long decline in the role of movie theaters in American life. I mean, you go back to the 1930s, people went to the movie theater a few times a week because there was no TV at home. My mother talked a lot about sort of walking down to going to the movie theater regularly. Whereas now it's more a special occasion. As people get bigger TVs and streaming services get better, the whole movie theater industry might slowly disappear or become very much of a niche item. Restaurants that don't transition effectively to takeout may struggle for several years. Now, in terms of bankruptcy, I think it's an important question. I think there's a big difference between big firms and small firms and how we deal with the whole possibility of bankruptcy. For the big firms, say an airline, bankruptcy is not as problematic. I mean, in the sense that if you're a large airline, you can go through Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Your shareholders may be wiped out, but the debt holders take over the business. The business can still continue to operate to the extent it can, given the new environment. And that's not something we need to worry about. Shareholders took risks when they bought shares. They get the upside when things are well. The shareholders should bear the downside when things aren't well. So Chapter 11 can work relatively well for a big company. And one of my publishers, for example, went through bankruptcy a few years ago. It didn't affect me as an author. It didn't affect professors using my books in their classes. They just went through a financial reorganization, went through Chapter 11, and the business continued on. This means they had too much debt, and they sort of restructured the debt. So that, I think, the airlines can go through bankruptcy without being a major economic disruption. Remember, the capital is still there. The planes don't disappear in a bankruptcy. They just get new owners. Small businesses are fundamentally different, because if you're a small business, Chapter 11 reorganization doesn't really work for you if you're a mom and pop store. It's not like the bank's going to come in and sort of run your pizza shop for you in the same way that you would have before. So I think it's much harder to figure out what to do with the small businesses, and that's why the Congress passed the Paycheck Protection Program, which I thought was extremely well intentioned. With the benefit of hindsight, we looked at it. Well, it wasn't all that well targeted. It cost a lot per job saved, according to the estimates that various studies have shown. So my guess is that history is not going to look at this as a great success, even though I think that the Congress's intention was all in the right place. And I think we economists have to think of, okay, what was the right solution? I don't think we really have a good solution. How do you help small businesses go through this period? To some degree, some of these small businesses probably should go under, right? If, for example, we're going to spend several years where people don't want to go to restaurants as much, then in any given town, you need fewer restaurants in equilibrium. There's still the demand for takeout. There'll still be demand for outdoor dining when the weather's nice, but there's just less seats needed in the restaurant industry, and sort of reallocating people and capital kind of makes sense. Similarly, the airlines were paid money to stay in business, and as long as they maintained employment. Well, there's a lot of sort of flight attendants and pilots that might have been looking, maybe should be looking for other jobs. We may have fewer flights for the next several years. And so rather than paying people to sit at home, at some point we might say, look, we'll give you some help, but maybe you should transition out of that old industry.
But do you then worry about a domino effect? What would that mean about the financial institutions that have lent money, even to big companies that can restructure? What does that mean?
Well, sure. I think so far we haven't seen a repeat of 2008.
Right.
Right. There have not really been big financial implications. That's in part because I think the Fed has been on top of things, but in part because the crisis really hasn't centered in the financial institutions. Right. In 2008, everything sort of started with the financial institutions. Here, it started with consumers being afraid to go out. And of course, that could have ramifications for financial institutions. One hopes they may be a little better capitalized than they were in 2008 through reforms. The Fed's also done a pretty good job of acting as lender of last resort in this downturn. And maybe if they do start running out of capital, maybe they will need to recapitalize again. But you're right, they could have repercussion effects. I think the Fed's done a reasonably good job, despite President Trump's frequent criticism of Jay Powell. I actually think I think he's done a pretty good job. I think Congress is doing. I think the first bill was extremely well intentioned and extremely quickly done. It was kind of amazing how we had such a big bipartisan, huge fiscal bill that went into effect so quickly. As I said, I don't think it was perfect, but I think given the speed with which they operate, you have to give them a little slack. When we shut down the university and sent students at home in the spring at Harvard, all classes immediately became pass-fail. In fact, we call it the special designation called emergency pass, emergency fail. And as you think, we thought it wasn't really fair to grade people A through F in the middle of a crisis. Well, I think maybe similarly with Congress, we shouldn't really grade them on an A through F scale. We should give them an emergency pass grade for what they did. So I think the Congress is going to have to sort of think about that. My guess is there'll be another fiscal stimulus, although fiscal stimulus is not really the right term. It's more of like disaster relief bill is really what it was. I mean, the reason I say it wasn't fiscal stimulus is less about putting people back to work, which is what a fiscal stimulus is about. Then it was like, okay, a bunch of people can't go back to work, so let's help them over this disaster. It's more like a hurricane relief than it is a traditional recession. So I think Congress did a pretty good job of things like expanding unemployment insurance and so on. I have my own ideas of how they might have done better, but I think they did a reasonable job, and they'll do another one. My guess is the next one won't be as big or as dramatic because we have recovered 3/4 of the way. If things get worse again, which they might, if we go back to April, which we might, and we decide we really need major shutdowns again, then you can imagine another big fiscal stimulus is necessary. I'm hopeful that's not necessary, in part because even though cases are way up, deaths are not nearly as up, which I don't know if we fully understand the reason for that, but it might be in part because you have better therapeutics, better treatments. So maybe this disease is becoming a little less lethal than it was when it was brand new.
Interesting. And since you mentioned, by the way, how much credit do you think President Trump deserves for the good economic performance prior to the pandemic? He likes to point out to the tax cuts, the deregulation, maybe even the tariffs on imports, mainly from China. I don't know what your take is on this, if there's any studies or.
Well, it's always hard. It's always hard to look at the output of the economy and say, okay, how much is due to good policy and how much is due to good luck? And I tend to think always good luck gets a lot of credit. It's very hard to sort out the effects of policies. Having said that, I think there's a pretty good literature that tax cuts do tend to stimulate the economy. I mean, there's a great paper by David and Christina Romer on this in the American Economic Review a few years ago. This is prior to the Trump tax cuts, but they basically show that tax cuts in general do tend to stimulate the economy, and the economy did get stimulated after the Trump tax cuts. Unemployment did fall lower after the Trump tax cuts than people thought possible. So if you look at sort of with the path of unemployment that the CBO is predicting in late 2016, it didn't go down as far as in fact happened. So things were better after the Trump tax cuts than people were predicting. How much is due to the tax cuts is very hard to say. I actually think some of the tax policy changes were good. I mean, the biggest part of the Trump tax bill, by the way, was reducing the corporate tax rate from the 35% that we had in the United States down to something closer to the average in the OECD, average in Europe, say. So I think it wasn't an extraordinarily radical tax cut. It was a big change compared to U.S. history. But if you compared our tax code to what exists in much of Europe, we were basically bringing our corporate tax in line with much of Europe. So I think that was fine. That was the biggest part. There's lots of small parts I didn't like. I didn't like the messy treatment of pass-through businesses. I didn't like the tax on university endowments. There's lots of small things in there. But I think the big thing, which was the reducing the corporate tax to international norms, was perfectly fine. It probably did stimulate the economy. Now, on the tariffs, I think the existing evidence on this is that it was a negative. I think most economists think that tariffs are usually not a good policy. And studies that have come out since then was a paper by Petty Goldberg and co-authors in the Quarterly Journal of Economics just I think a year or so ago that finds that it was a negative. It was a relatively small one. If you look at sort of the total impact on welfare, netting out the winners and losers, obviously some people benefited, some people were hurt. But if you sort of net out winners and losers, there's a small negative, but not a huge one. I mean, the thing that we teach when we do international trade and sort of principles of economics is tariffs tend to be a bad thing, but there's winners and losers, right? It's not unambiguous in the sense of that everybody's worse off. Mm-hmm. And that's probably the way to think about this tariff policy. Some people are better off, some people are worse off. A small net negative, but probably not catastrophic.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Now, what's interesting to me is that even during the good, let's say, performance of the U.S. economy right before the pandemic, there were still people who were dissatisfied. In fact, I think Americans have been dissatisfied for a long time with the performance of the economy. And some policy analysts, I believe, attribute the election of an outsider like Donald Trump exactly to this dissatisfaction. So why do you think that is? Why have people been complaining?
Well, if you look at the exit poll results from the 2016 election, what you find is that people with a college degree voted for Hillary Clinton pretty decisively. People without a college degree, say high school graduate, voted for Donald Trump pretty decisively. So there's a huge gap between what you might think of skilled and unskilled voters. And that's very different from previous elections. If you look at previous elections, usually the people with and without college degrees kind of vote similarly. So usually they sort of move up and down together, but there's a big divergence in the 2016 election. Now, there's many possible reasons why that can be the case, but I think a large part of it is that the economy had not been good for many years for people without a college degree. So the people without a college degree were dissatisfied with the economy. They thought the elites had let them down. And if you look at sort of the wages of real wages of people without college degrees, they've been flat. Indeed, for men, have been stagnating, actually been falling for the past couple decades. So I think there was the people who were dissatisfied with what was going on had reason to be dissatisfied because it actually shows up in the data. Now, whether Trump was the right answer is, of course, a different question. But Trump did promise to shake up the elites, and he has. I mean, for better or worse, he's certainly shaking things up. And so you understand sort of why these people feel that way. And I still understand maybe to this day why they feel this way. If you really thought things needed to be shaken up, and I'm not a Trump supporter, but I understand why people. I have members of my family who are, my extended family, and I understand why they feel that way. They felt like they were distrustful of what was going on in Washington because they felt things weren't going well for certain parts of the economy. And that really traces to two sort of broader trends, which is one, we've had a period of relatively slow growth, and we've had a period of rising inequality. And both those things tend to depress wages at the low end.
So since you mentioned that, what do you think are the reasons behind both of those two phenomena? Why do you think we have seen a slowdown in the growth of income per capita in the United States, and why have we seen an increase in inequality since I think around the 80s or so?
Yeah, let's start off the slower growth first. Now, there's a wonderful book by Bob Gordon, who's a professor at Northwestern University. It's called The Rise and Fall of American Growth. And his basic argument is that in the previous 100 years, we saw some really major life-changing innovations. We saw, electrification, saw the internal combustion engine, we saw indoor plumbing. These were kind of things that completely changed life, changed the way work is as well. And it sort of was driving productivity higher, and therefore driving living standards higher. And his argument is that, yes, we're still experiencing productivity growth, but we're just experiencing lower rates of productivity growth than we experienced in the past. So, for example, if I could ask you, if you had a choice between giving up indoor plumbing or giving up your Twitter account, my guess is you wouldn't have any trouble deciding, right? I mean, the indoor plumbing really changed their life dramatically. And so for some people, their Twitter account changed their live dramatically, but presumably not as profoundly as indoor plumbing has. So I think Gordon is basically saying we're in for an era of slower productivity growth. And there's nothing in economic theory that says that productivity has to continue growing at 2% forever, right? Throughout most of human history, it grew much less than that. Once the Industrial Revolution started, we started experiencing rapid productivity growth at roughly 2% a year, so it roughly doubles every generation. But God never came down and promised us that was forever, that those productivity was going to grow in the sky. So you can imagine this slowing down over time. And some research by Chad Jones at Stanford that's consistent with that, where he has a paper that's literally called "Ideas Are Getting Harder to Find." And the title of the paper basically summarizes the conclusion, which is that he's saying, look, we've had this tremendous increase in the number of knowledge workers, the number of people whose job it is to come up with new ideas. And so we're putting lots and lots of people into knowledge creation and finding technological breakthroughs, and they're just not finding them as fast as previous generations does. It's not like Elon Musk is less smart than Thomas Edison. They're both sort of important entrepreneurs, pushing the technological frontier forward. But maybe Elon Musk is living in an environment where the easy fruits have already been picked, and he doesn't have the easy stuff that Thomas Edison get to invent. And so Elon Musk is sort of inventing stuff like electric cars, important, but it's not going to be as life changing as Thomas Edison. So overall productivity growth is slow. So I think that's the answer to your first question. On your second question about productivity, about increasing inequality. That, I think, is another topic that's generated lots of research. It's really fascinating. The trend towards increasing inequality started sometime in the mid-70s, I'd time it, and basically continued through to roughly to today. I mean, the past few years has not seen particularly rising inequality, but it reached a high level and then so stayed there. It hasn't really started reversing itself. Although I think actually the most recent observation is slight decline in inequality in 2019 over 2018. But so the question, what caused that 50-year trend or 45-year trend towards rising inequality? There's a lot of explanations out there, and it may not be one thing going on. I think there's probably several things that are going on. But I think one of the most important things comes in the title of a book by two of my colleagues at Harvard. The colleagues are Claudia Golden and Larry Katz. And their book is called "The Race Between Education and Technology," and that sort of summarizes their thesis. The idea is that technology tends to find ways to replace unskilled workers. Think of automation, for example, or even think of an automatic teller machine, that ATM, which replaced the in-person tellers. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when I went to the bank, I had to wait in line, talk to a real human teller to get cash out. Now nobody does that. Just wait in the line as a machine that gives you your cash. So what did they do? To replace the relatively unskilled banking job, a teller, but presumably created jobs for software engineers and people who could operate those. So technology tends to replace unskilled workers and create jobs for skilled workers. And that's economists call that skill bias technological change. The other side of that seesaw is education. What education does is it turns unskilled workers into skilled workers. And what Claudia and Larry say is, look, throughout throughout most of the post-war period until roughly the 1970s, the pace of educational advance was increasing quite rapidly. So people were, things like the GI Bill, more and more people were going to college, more and more people were becoming engineers and skilled workers. So in that race between education and technology, education was winning. So technology was reducing the demand for unskilled workers, but education was reducing the supply of them even faster. And as a result, the wages of unskilled workers could rise. And then education kind of plateaued. We stopped sending more and more people to school. Graduation rates didn't keep increasing. And as a result, we got skill bias, technological change, the reduced demand for unskilled workers exacerbated. Reduced the demand for, reduced the wages of unskilled workers. Now, two forces, by the way, that add to that, besides skill bias, technological change, are globalization and immigration. Right? Globalization, we trade more with the rest of the world. Then we tend to export goods produced with skilled labor, tend to import goods produced with unskilled labor, and that tends to reduce the demand for unskilled labor here. In fact, that's very much, technology and globalization are very similar, right? If you're an unskilled worker in a factory and you're replaced by a robot, that's not very different from being replaced by an unskilled worker abroad. It doesn't really matter if you're being replaced. You're being replaced by something, the demand for your labor goes down. In both cases, it increases the demand for skilled workers. If you're being replaced by a robot, we need a software engineer to program the robot. If you're being replaced by a worker abroad, we need some skilled managers who are going to negotiate those international supply chains. So you saw this sort of, both globalization and technology are going to act to increase the demand for the skilled and reduce the demand for the unskilled. And immigration is similar in the sense that, if we have unskilled immigration in particular, if you have a flow of unskilled workers here, that's going to tend to increase the supply of unskilled workers and depress the wage of unskilled Americans. And my colleague at the Kennedy School of Government, George Borjas, has done a lot of work studying how the influx of unskilled workers, mainly from the South, tended to reduce the wages of unskilled Americans. So I think Donald Trump was, for a little bit, on the right track when he talks about globalization and immigration hurting unskilled Americans. I think overall the U.S. economy benefits from those things. So I'm loath to embrace his policies, but if you're only focused on the wages of the unskilled, then he's probably right that globalization and immigration has hurt unskilled Americans.
Do you think there's an interplay between globalization and technology? For example, communication technology now allows superstar athletes, actors, performers to trade with way more people than they would be able to otherwise. And so this means that it inflates the income, the economic rent of talent, let's say. Do you think that has something to do with it?
No, absolutely. I think there's a lot of interplay between globalization and technology. I mean, when I was born in 1958, there were only, I think, it's a few hundred lines to call between Europe and the United States. So doing international call was a big deal and very expensive. And of course, there was no email. So trying to negotiate international supply chains was really difficult. Now it's very easy. I'm in the middle of actually coming out the 11th edition of my intermediate macro book. And I've been dealing with the person who's a compositor who's in charge of setting taking my manuscript, turning it to pages that'll eventually get sent off to a printer. And I was halfway through this process of getting through the book, and I realized that the person I was dealing with was in India. We were emailing back and forth, and I had no idea where he was. And that's the kind of thing that would have been impossible. In the days before the internet, whereas now they can sort of break up the supply chain, and so all of a sudden it's creating the demand in India and presumably reducing the demand for whatever skills a compositor has in the United States. So I mean that technology is really important. And you mentioned the superstars. I think there's been an increase in the what economist Sherwin Rosen once called the superstar phenomenon of so small number of people getting a very, very large share of the market. If Taylor Swift is the best singer in the world, then everybody can enjoy Taylor Swift's music simply by, we can send it via iTunes to literally everyone can listen to Taylor Swift. In the days before electronic communication, if you want to hear a good singer, you got to go to a concert hall and hear the good singer. And Taylor Swift could only entertain a few hundred people at a time, whereas now she can entertain literally millions at a time. So I think technology has allowed sort of for the growth of superstars. And so Sherwin Rosen's theory of superstars, which he I think wrote in the 1980s, has in some sense become even more true in the 40 years since he wrote about it.
Mm-hmm. So if that's the case, then what should policymakers do, if anything, to address the issue of inequality?
Well, I think there's really two sort of classes of solutions. One is addressing the cause, and the other is addressing the symptoms. So just the causes, I think it gets back to education. We're trying to increase the supply of the skilled workers and reduce the supply of the unskilled. So that education can start winning that race between education and technology again. I think that's the best tool we have. I think other tools, I think the immigration and the anti-globalization forces are not right, because I think we generally benefit from immigration. I think we generally benefit from globalization, even if certain people are hurt. So I don't think that's the best tool. I think education is the best tool in terms of addressing the causes. In terms of addressing the symptoms, then the question becomes, what's the optimal degree of redistribution, and what tools might we use to redistribute? I'm actually personally a fan of this idea that Andrew Yang talked about a lot during the campaign, which is the universal basic income. This idea basically goes back in economics a long, long way. If you read Milton Friedman's 1962 book, Capitalism and Freedom, he talks about a negative income tax, which is basically like an income tax, but if your income is low, rather than paying a tax, you get money back from the government. That's the negative part of it. And he doesn't call it universal basic income, but that's basically what it is. It's another way of describing a universal basic income. So
James Buchanan in Ethical Limits of Taxation, I believe, argues for something.
Oh, is that true? That's interesting. I did not know that.
Yeah.
Yes. And so economists of both the right and the left, you can sort of, Milton Friedman was sort of economists of the right, but you can find economists of the left advocating this as well. So you have, so a lot of economists have talked about that. It's a very different conception that we have today in our policy. And in our policy today, we have social safety nets that aim to try to identify people who are needy and say, well, it's needy people we're going to give money to. So if you're old, we'll give you money through Social Security, or if you're disabled, we'll give you money through a disability program. Or if you're unemployed, we'll give you money through unemployment insurance. Or if you're working poor, you have low wages, we'll give it through EITC. And so it tries to identify the needy, but a lot of people fall between the cracks because they're trying to identify the needy. You're not going to necessarily get all of them. Whereas the universal basic income says, look, we're not going to try to identify the needy. We're going to assure everybody has a minimum level of income. We can get everybody at, say, the normal number, I think, is like $1,000 a month. That's what like Andrew Yang talked about. We get everybody $1,000 a month, which is not a huge amount of money. That basically brings a single person up to roughly the poverty line. We're not going to let anybody fall below the poverty line. So regardless of who you are, you're getting $1,000 check a month. If you're Bill Gates, that's not going to mean anything. You're probably going to pay more of it back in taxes. But if you're a truly poor person and you haven't demonstrated need throughout some other program, $1,000 a month could go a long way to improving your quality of life. So I'm actually sympathetic to that. It's a very different mindset than the traditional view. A lot of Americans are skeptical of this because they say, well, if somebody's able-bodied, can work, why should we be giving them any money? I don't think that many people will be satisfied living at the level of $1,000 a month if they really have opportunities to work, to earn more. I think they'd take it. So I'm not as concerned about the adverse incentive effects. I'm sure there would be some, but I don't think it's a major concern. And I think providing people a minimum guarantee is something well worth considering.
And going also back a little bit to the reduced growth rate and Bob Gordon's ideas. I think you mentioned Judge Jones. I think it's interesting. I think he's convinced Paul Romer, who won a Nobel Prize for arguing that we can actually stimulate economic growth by investing in R&D. I think now he's becoming more skeptical based on their joint work. So my question is that if Robert Gordon, Charles Jones, if they are correct, then what is there anything that the government can do to generate faster economic growth, or should we just accept that this is just the situation, and that's the best we can do.
Well, I think I mean, things like research and development tax credits are important. I think there are externalities associated with the creation of knowledge. So I think, encouraging more engineers, PhDs in the sciences. I think institutions like the National Institute of Health are tremendously important. Some of the advances that we may see may not show up in normal GDP. So for example, we are making a lot of progress in knowledge about how to prolong and expand life. The pandemic notwithstanding, medical technology is vastly better than it was a generation ago. That improvement in the quality, in the length of life may not show up in standard GDP statistics. But as a person who's 62 now, the idea of having a lot of technology around that's going to keep me living 5 or 10 years longer than I would have if I were a generation older is, I think, extremely valuable from a welfare standpoint. So I think there are advances where I think we are living better than we ever have before, but it may not show up in the sort of the normal way measures of income.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting. So, so one of the issues that has not been brought about in the debate, the presidential debates, is the situation with Medicare and Social Security. I guess maybe because it's a hot potato topic. So I think Professor Lawrence Kotlikoff has written a lot on this, that those programs are expected to pay more than they're expected to take in. And those unfunded liabilities are on the order of over like $200 trillion, which is a huge, huge number. And that if we don't do anything about them, they will become insolvent in just a matter of decades. So the question is, what are some hard choices that we're going to have to face? Do you think that those programs can survive, and under which circumstances?
I think they can survive. They're not going to survive in exactly the form they are now. Most basic, if you look at Larry Kolikoff's projections or the similar projections that the Congressional Budget Office does, the long-term fiscal outlook, you basically see that under current policy, it means if we don't change anything, the debt to GDP ratio is going to basically go off to infinity over. And of course that won't happen because something we will change things along the way. But say if nothing changed, they would go off to infinity eventually. And the reason is because we're living longer, therefore we're collecting Social Security for more years. Healthcare costs are going up because we're inventing more ways to help sick people, and we're paying for people's healthcare, the elderly's healthcare through Medicare, and we're paying through a lot of the poor's healthcare through Medicaid, and all those, and we're paying some middle class people through the Obamacare subsidies. So all of the government programs for health and retirement are going to basically push government spending up higher and higher over time, and it'll start happening in more and more numbers as the baby boom retires. I'm sort of smack in the middle of the baby boom at 62. Sort of when my generation when my cohort starts retiring in bigger numbers in say 5 or 8 years, these numbers will keep going up. So the question is, well, what are we going to do about that? In some sense, it really comes down to pretty easy trade-offs. Like, do you want higher taxes or do you want lower spending? And we're going to have to choose. It'll be a generational battle about which of those two it is, because the lower spending is going to be lower spending on those people who are retired, and the higher taxes are going to be higher taxes on those people who are working age and paying most of the taxes. And the question is, which of those are they going to do? People who want to do this in a form of spending are eager to do it sooner, because it's easier to tell people, oh, we're going to cut your Social Security benefits in 5 years, 10 years. Please save more for your own retirement if you want a comfortable retirement, than it is to say, oh, we're cutting retirement benefits today. Sorry, guys. We know we promised these for years and years, but tough luck. So if we're going to cut retirement benefits, then it's probably better to do it in advance so you can phase it in. If you're going to do it on taxes, this is less of a compelling case to phase in, because you can always raise taxes later, although that's not going to be terribly politically popular. I think we certainly have the room to raise taxes. A lot of European countries have higher tax rates than the United States. So obviously a country can survive with higher tax rates than the United States does. Europe tends to do this with more efficient taxes than we have. In particular, many European countries have a value-added tax, which is basically a flat consumption tax, that tends to be a fairly efficient way to raise revenue. I think we've learned from other countries' experience. So I think if the United States says we want to raise taxes to European levels, I don't think it's going to be, oh, just raise taxes on the rich more. I mean, candidate Biden says he's only going to raise taxes on the top 1%, people making more than $400,000 a year. You're not going to solve the problem that way because there's not enough money there. So you're going to have to raise taxes in the broad middle class. There are tools to do that. A value-added tax will be one way to do that. And if we really want to solve this problem of the next generation with higher taxes, a value-added tax kind of makes sense. Personally, by the way, I'm sympathetic to the idea of raising the retirement age, of saying, look, people are living longer, they're healthier at younger ages, old ages, so in their 60s, they're healthier, so we can expect people to work a little bit longer. When you poll economists tend to like that solution. That actually gets pretty well, that seems to get pretty high marks among economists. I infer from that economists like their jobs, so they don't mind working a few extra years. But if you ask the general public that, they hate that idea. And indeed, there's been occasionally pushes to like reduce the age of eligibility for Medicare to younger ages, not older ages. So if you talk, so the economists' view of, oh, let's just work a few years longer has been less popular than things like raising taxes. Raising taxes might actually be less popular once you actually start doing it, which explains to people that, oh gosh, we have to raise middle class taxes to pay for all this. The alternative solutions might be more attractive. I mean, the way to think about the tax debate right now is, there's a 99% agreement between Republicans and Democrats. I say that because like the Democrats only want to raise taxes in the top 1%, and the Republicans don't want to raise taxes on anybody. And so they're 99% agreement. And they may both be wrong. It may be both that we really need to raise taxes on the broad middle class to pay for the programs that we want, like Social Security and Medicare. But nobody's willing to say that. It's kind of this, and I think a lot of people in the Congress kind of know that. I have a suspicion that a lot of these sort of well-known truths among economists, like the importance of sort of a broad-based tax increase if we want to pay for the programs we have, I think that's kind of known by people in Congress. But since you're running for election every 2 years, you don't want to be the first person to admit it. So at some point, somebody will be willing to admit it and say, oh yeah, that's right, we knew this all along. But nobody's willing to say that now.
But what kind of tax increases are we talking about? If we were to close the gap almost entirely by raising taxes, do you think it's feasible?
I think if we went to VATs, the level you see in much of Western Europe, I think we could. Part of the issue becomes, by the way, is what's going to happen to interest rates. Because part of the cost of these programs has to do with the cost of debt service, the debt we've already accumulated. So the things like Social Security and Medicare is implicit debt. That has to be added to the explicit debt that we've already accumulated, which is now reaching record highs. In the middle of the pandemic, where the debt to GDP ratio is reaching the highest level since World War II. Which is, how costly is that going to be to service this government debt? It's explicit government debt. The CBO, and I think Larry Cullicle, but I'm not sure about that, tends to assume that we're going to go back to historical levels of interest rates that are more historically normal. That might be the case. But right now, long-term interest rates are at really, really low levels. The 30-year inflation-adjusted interest rate on government bonds is negative 30 basis points, negative 1/3%. So that costs nothing to service. It's really costs us, they're literally paying us to borrow money. So servicing this explicit debt is not very costly, and that suggests that servicing this implicit debt in Social Security and Medicare won't be as bad. If interest rates go back to normal levels, and the normal level of real interest rates is something like 2 or 3% rather than negative 30 basis points. If we go back to normal levels of interest rates, then I think these long-term fiscal problems become more serious. And at negative 30 basis points, it stays this way for a long time, as the markets seem to be thinking right now, then this won't be as serious. It will require presumably smaller tax increases to pay for all these promises we made.
Now, the need to deal with this issue, how does that constrain the ability of policymakers to fulfill other promises? I mean, we've seen, forgiving student debt, spending a lot of money to make homes more, efficient, or dealing in other ways with climate change. how likely is it that those funds will be available to fulfill those promises?
Well, I think there's a tendency in campaigns for people to overpromise spending programs, and you saw that a lot in the Democratic primary this time. In particular, I actually think Joe Biden's going to govern more as a moderate, but he ended up campaigning the primary against Bernie Sanders, and he moved his proposals, his specific proposals, were pretty far to the left, both in terms of spending increases and in terms of tax increases. I don't think he'll do that. In part because I don't think in his heart of heart he wants to do that. Although I don't know Joe Biden personally, so I can't exactly say what it says in his heart of hearts. But his whole history sees he's more of a moderate than he seemed. And secondly, because I don't think he could get that far left fiscal programs through a Congress that even if the Democrats take over, it'll be a fairly narrow majority in the Senate. So I don't think he's going to get a lot of the farther left spending programs through. In terms of climate change, by the way, that could be a revenue raiser rather than a way to increase spending. I mean, no, I've written many times about the importance of a carbon tax in order to incentivize people to reduce their carbon footprint. I've written about that for many times over a course of maybe 20 years. I think there's a pretty broad consensus among economists that a carbon tax is the right solution. There's some debate about how large the optimal carbon tax is, but I think there's a consensus that it's bigger than zero, which is where we are now. And a carbon tax could raise some revenue that could be used to fund a variety of things. I have a proposal that I've signed on to, which is sometimes referred to as the Schultz-Baker proposal. These George Schultz and James Baker, former secretaries of state, are probably the two highest profile co-signers of this. And our plan is to tax carbon, reduce a lot of the regulations on carbon emissions that you don't need anymore once you've incentivized people correctly. You can let prices do the job. You don't need regulations to do the job. And then use the revenue from this to give people lump sum rebates. And so it would fund a full universal basic income, like $1,000 a month, but it would be rebated similar to a universal basic income to everyone. Under that plan, roughly the bottom 2/3 of households would get more back in the rebates than paying carbon taxes. So the whole plan would be progressive because your carbon footprint is progressive. It gets bigger as you get richer because you have bigger houses. You're more likely to fly in jets and gas guzzling cars. So the tax would rise with income and the rebates would be lump sum. The plan together would be progressive. It would probably violate Biden's plan of only raising taxes in the top 1% because that's a very small slice. But it would certainly be progressive if you're worried about the sort of overall distribution. So I think that's something that I'm hopeful that some future Congress could take out because I think there is a consensus on that. And to be honest, it's another one of those issues that I think most members of Congress know that is the right thing to do, but nobody wants to be sort of the first one to say I'm in favor of raising a tax.
And as far as Social Security goes, I mean, there are some people who argue that the pay-as-you-go system we have in place made sense when population was growing fast, productivity was growing fast, but both productivity and population are now growing slower, and so it may make more sense to move to a fully capitalized system. What's your take on that? And if we were to do that, how could we transition to such a system?
Yeah, my late colleague Marty Feldstein has written a lot about the virtues of that, and I'm of two minds of it. I think if you could snap your fingers and move from a pay-as-you-go system, suddenly move to a different universe with a fully funded system, I would snap my fingers and I'd be happy to do that. So basically, it'd be the equivalent of everyone having the equivalent of a 401k plan that was fully funded with stocks and bonds and some regulations to make sure they don't take undue risks and make sure they have enough in there to support themselves. So you can imagine an alternative world in which the mandatory 401k plans would have been an alternative to the current Social Security system. I'm less convinced that moving to that system from where we are should be a major goal, because a large part of the problem is in the transition. Given that we have a pay-as-you-go system, and we can't sort of snap our fingers and jump to an alternative universe, what would we have to do to get to fully funded? Well, some generation would have, like, presumably, if we want to do it now, this current generation is working, would have to both pay off the promises made to the current retired generation and put enough aside for their own retirement. So that's something they'd be hit twice as hard. And maybe you could do that, but you have to do it spread out over a long period of time, over many generations, because it'd be really unfair to tell one generation, I'm sorry, we blew it at the beginning. My father's generation got a lot more in Social Security than he ever paid in. When Franklin Roosevelt set up the system, he started paying, and his successors soon after him, he started paying out much more money than the people who had paid into the system had accumulated in present value. So the early generations sort of got at a really great deal. Those guys are gone. They're dead. You can't get back. So given that, but you still have obligations to the current retirees, and you can't just sort of screw them. So I think that the transition is sufficiently difficult that we shouldn't expect too much in trying to transition to a fully funded system. It may be well worth doing, but I'm not sure it's necessarily the highest priority right now.
Mm-hmm. So it seems to me that we're facing a lot of challenges going ahead. So my final question to you is, how optimistic are you about the future, our ability to address those challenges, especially given the political climate also?
Well, the political climate we're living in now is as toxic as it's probably been in many, many years. I'm hopeful that that'll change over time. I'm guessing that Joe Biden's going to win next week. It looks likely, based on people who do these forecasts, like Nate Silver, whose forecasts he's getting Biden an 88% chance based on recent polling. So that seems reasonable to me. Although Donald Trump surprised us, so he could surprise us again. So I'm guessing in our Biden presidency, there'll be a little less polarization, just because he's less of a controversial figure. So I tend to think political polarization will go down. I think even though we may be in an era of slower technological change, I think technological change will still be positive. I tend to think that we're still going to be better off a generation from now than we are today. Maybe we won't be growing as fast as our previous generations grow, but it'll still be progress. I think one of the biggest threats to that optimistic scenario is climate change, but I'm hopeful that we'll find ways to move away from fossil fuels and other things. My understanding, for example, is that solar power has come down in price a lot in the past 10, 20 years, and I think technological change will eventually solve that problem. So I tend to be optimistic, but the one thing to keep in mind is that the world is vastly more uncertain than we always give it credit for. Think of this pandemic. I mean, if somebody had told you we'd be in a state we're in now 12 months ago, you say, no, that seems like preposterous. And who knows what the next unexpected crisis will be? Maybe some asteroid landing in the middle of Times Square. There's always something that seems completely out of the blue that hits us. I don't presumably have those. I think we come back from it. After 9/11, it seemed like terrorism was could be a big risk. We haven't had a major terrorist attack in the United States since then. I mean major, I meant it's killing thousands of people. So I tend to be optimistic, but I also recognize that the world is vastly uncertain. So in terms of giving you some investment advice, I definitely invest in the U.S. and world economies. I buy stocks and bonds, but I don't overdo it, because I recognize that things could get worse in the short run. And so I believe in holding a balanced portfolio in order to say, yes, the world's going to get better. I'm going to invest if I'm an optimist, but also be a realist and recognizing that unexpected things could happen. And I think policymakers need to think about the same thing. Think about contingency planning. Think about how things could go wrong and plan for it, even though you're hopeful, cautiously optimistic that things will go right.
Mm-hmm. All right, so at this point, I think we're an hour, and I exhausted my questions. So I think we should open the floor to questions and answers from the attendees. Robbie, I don't know if you've gotten any questions.
I've got a bunch of questions, yes. So I'm going to just read those questions to you, Greg, and then we'll get your answers. So there's a question about 401ks. Right now, 401k accounts look good, but if all those businesses go under due to the pandemic, what is the future? Do we work longer if we have jobs, etc.?
The stock market has done incredibly well, despite the fact the economy is really struggling now. The question is why that is. I think there's a couple reasons. I think one is that we've learned that while this pandemic is affecting some businesses, businesses that are hardest hit are the small businesses, not the large businesses that are probably dominating your 401k account. So, you may stop going to your local store to buy things. That local store may be going out of business, but that local store may be a mom and pop store anyway. It's not maybe not be a publicly traded company. Instead, you're buying your stuff from Jeff Bezos and Amazon. And so Amazon has been doing great in this time. So I think that's part of it, that the large companies have been weathering this downturn better than small businesses. The second reason the stock market is doing well is that interest rates have fallen so much. So if you look at as I mentioned earlier, that the 30-year bond is at negative 30 basis points, or the real TIPS bond, inflation adjusted bonds, negative 30 basis points. That was not true before, a year ago. And so over the course of this pandemic and recession, long-term bonds have fallen in price. And when you're thinking about where to allocate your savings, deciding between stocks and bonds look pretty unattractive. That tends to bid up stocks. So I think for those two reasons, stock prices have been fairly robust. If I'm advising someone how to handle their 401ks, don't try to market time. Nobody's smart enough to market time. Think of a portfolio that you can live with, in the sense that you can handle the ups and downs, and then just stick with that asset allocation. So I personally am about 60% stocks, about 40% bonds. I kind of stick through that through thick and thin. I try not to market time. It's tempting sometimes, but you really don't know what's going to happen. And I think that we have a long history of the people who market time are just as likely to get it wrong as to get it right. And by market timing, you're adding to your risk by putting a lot of risk in some moments and less risk in other moments. And you want to sort of diversify across time by holding sort of stocks in all time periods in some moderate degree.
So we have a question here from Rob Schwartz. During the Fed's Jackson Hole Symposium earlier this year, economists presented a paper outlining a hypothesis that the magnitude of this COVID-induced economic downturn will scar business executives' beliefs about the probability of extreme future economic scenarios. In other words, executives will now be materially more conservative in their decision to tie up capital in fixed investment and rather hold higher reserves. Do you foresee a much slower recovery and subsequent lower long-term trend in business fixed investment moving forward? And what would that mean for long-run real GDP?
Yeah, there's a tendency for dramatic events to affect people's psyches more than they thought. So there's evidence, for example, that people who lived through the Great Depression were more conservative than as consumers and investors than people who didn't live through the Great Depression, because they saw the Great Depression was a event that could easily happen again. And it's conceivable that business executives might look at this event as something that would make them more conservative. If so, that's going to mean that risk premiums are going to go up. The Fed's going to have to set lower long-term interest rates than they otherwise would in order to maintain full employment. So I think that's a possibility. I really don't think we know enough about that yet. But I think that is. I think it's a plausible hypothesis at this point. It's still unproven.
From Murray Shapiro about income inequality. If we separate out those who get extremely wealthy from new internet companies, where owners and many employees get enormously wealthy, has income inequality grown significantly among the others?
Yeah, income inequality has grown however you look at it. And if you look at the very, very top, the 0.1%, 0.01%, you see tremendous growth in incomes and wealth there. But even if you look at sort of more moderate people, if you look at sort of somebody at the 80th percentile versus somebody at the 20th percentile, sort of more sort of normal, upper middle class versus lower middle class, you see there's growth there. So it's true that you see the top sliver really taking off because of things like the internet company, but not only the internet company. Taylor Swift, who makes a lot of money off her music, or Robert Downey Jr., who made $50 million just from the one movie, The Avengers. You sort of see these sort of the growth of these superstars at all different parts of the economy. So I think that's is a pervasive phenomenon. But inequality is not just the top sliver. It's really fact, there's a wonderful paper by David Otter at MIT called "The Inequality among the 99%."
Right.
Even if you don't look at the top 1%, there's still a lot of inequality growing among the bottom 99%. So it's not just a story of the top 1%. It's partly a story of the 1%, but it's not only a story of the 1%.
From Jerry Krause, what about corporations not paying people decent wages, but giving themselves big salaries and bonuses? Didn't the corporate tax cuts go mainly to the rich, but didn't increase investment and productivity? The tax code has many thousands of loopholes, which also benefit the rich, no?
Well, one of this big debate in economics about what is the incidence of the corporate income tax. You know, corporation is really a group of people getting together to do something. There's owners, there's which are the shareholders. There's the workers. There's the customers. And the question is, when you cut the corporate income tax, who benefits among those three groups? I think in the short run, for sure, it benefits the shareholders, who tend, on average, to be wealthier. Well, not all of them are wealthy. You can be, if you own your 401k plan, you're a shareholder through that probably. So they're not all super wealthy, but they tend to be disproportionately wealthier people. But there are many economists who believe that by encouraging economic growth, the lower corporate income tax rate eventually gets passed down to workers in the form of higher wages. And the fact that we did start seeing robust wage growth before COVID hit is some small piece of evidence in favor of that. It's hard to prove cause and effect, but it's certainly consistent with the hypothesis. And I know for sure, if Kevin Hassett were here, who was chief economist for Donald Trump, he would give Donald Trump a lot of credit for the growth in wages up through 2019, and he'd put a lot of it on the corporate tax cuts. Because a lot of his particular work was establishing connections between corporate tax rates and growth in real wages for production workers.
From Howard Litvak, do you believe reinventing capitalism by using the tax code to incentivize corporate America to share some of the company profits with workers would be an effective approach to higher growth?
Well, I think running a high pressure economy that has low unemployment induces corporations to raise wages, not because they become suddenly altruistic in that environment, but because they have to pay higher wages to attract workers. So I think ultimately it's supply and demand that's going to determine wages, and running a high pressure economy is one way to increase the demand for labor and increase real wages. I think trying to reform corporations to make them altruistic and is probably unrealistic. I think corporations are there for a purpose. If you're a CEO, you're hired to be a fiduciary for shareholders. Shareholders are given money to this corporation in order to make a profit. And I think telling CEOs, "Oh, don't worry about the shareholders. Worry about everybody else. You're broadly competent social planners to do good for the world, not just make a profit," is unrealistic. If you have some CEO who suddenly stops making a profit, if his company is floundering and not producing returns, the board of directors is not going to take the excuse, "Oh, don't worry, I'm not making any returns for shareholders, but I'm doing lots of good for the world." They're going to fire that CEO, or some corporate raider is going to take over the company and fire the CEO. So I think the idea that we're going to look to CEOs as being the savior, as being our social planners writ large, I think is unrealistic. That's the job of our elected officials. People like the president, Congress, the Senate, our governors. Those are the people who are supposed to be run society in a way that benefits all of us. Corporations have a fairly narrow role. It's how to take shareholder money and invest it profitably. That doesn't mean they should be unpleasant to their other stakeholders, right? If you want to run a successful business, you got to be nice to your customers. You got to be nice to your workers, because you're not going to have good customers and good workers if you don't act like a good partner. So even in the context of profit maximization, being a good corporate citizen with customers and workers makes sense. But saying, "Oh, it's the job of a CEO to be a social planner and look out for broader social interests," I think is probably not realistic.
From Paul Nagel, is quantitative easing an acceptable monetary theory? It's crowding out in history?
I think quantitative easing, which is basically the Fed buying longer-term bonds, and not just short-term bonds, which it usually does, in order to get long-term interest rates down. I think it's now goes under the general category called unconventional monetary policy. And what happened during 2008, and it's happening again now, is that the Fed's normal instrument, which is short-term interest rates, federal funds rate, basically hits the effective lower bound of roughly 0. And then it's looking for other ways to stimulate the economy if it needs it. And unconventional monetary policy it's the Fed's search for these alternative tools that it can use. And the two tools are quantitative easing, which is buying longer-term bonds, and forward guidance, which is committing the Fed to future actions in order to influence expectations and in turn influence longer-term interest rates through that channel. I think both of them are effective to a degree. I think the economics profession is still debating among itself as to how effective it is. I had a friend point out to me recently, thought something kind of interesting. He said, most of the studies you see arguing that quantitative easing is very effective tend to come out of the Fed. And studies that don't come out of the Fed seem to be more skeptical of quantitative easing. And maybe that does seem to be a general pattern. And maybe that's because the Fed really is trying to convince people that, don't worry, we really haven't run out of ammunition. And maybe it's they're trying to reassure people. That's possible. I think it's still an open question of how effective it is. There are other sort of more radical ways to empower the Fed to stimulate the economy. I mean, one thing that's a little bit more radical is to raise the target rate for inflation. I mean, the target rate is now 2%. If the target rate were, say, 4%, as some people have suggested, then nominal interest rates would normally be higher, and you'd have more room to cut them when you needed to in recessions. There's some economic logic there too. Well, again, no central banker has been willing to endorse that because they've been talking about 2% as the target for so long. Another really radical idea, if you want to be really radical about this, some economists have talked about getting rid of currency. Imagine that all money were electronic. The government said, going forward, all money you're going to have is going to be electronic records in your checking account. Currency doesn't exist as a form of money anymore. So by the state, please deposit all your money in the banking system. If we had that system where there was no currency, then we no longer have an effective lower bound of 0 on interest rates. They could lower the interest rate as much as they wanted. There's no reason that interest rates couldn't be -5. That's something that economists talk about. My former student, Miles Kimball, at University of Colorado, or was it Colorado State? Anyway, someplace in Colorado has been writing about talking about sort of how we effectively implement negative interest rates. That would be politically very, very unpopular. If they basically told you, I'm sorry, you have to deposit all your money in a bank account so that we, the feds, can take 5% of it away from you every year. I think that would not be a politically popular move. So no central banker has gone down that route, but it is a way that would surely empower monetary policy.
From Paris iPhone, how do you see commercial real estate as an investment looking forward?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think one of the big issues is going to be, is work from home a temporary aberration or the thing of the future? And people will be evaluating how well it worked and how much you can continue this. My sense for classes is that it's reasonable, but not as good as in-person classes. So I think, for example, when the pandemic is really behind us, we'll go back to in-person teaching, and we may have an online option. But I think most students are going to benefit more from having a teacher in front of them where they can chat with them after class or before class and look in their eye rather than through a Zoom call. Some other businesses may find themselves doing more things remotely. So, for example, I work with an editor who works on my book. She's a freelance development editor. I've been working with her remotely forever. I mean, she and I, we have a great relationship, but we only get together like once a year to have lunch just to be friendly. We never talk about work in person. All our work is basically done via email or phone calls. So I think some business relationships work fine electronically, some don't. I think as some businesses find they can do more stuff remotely from people's houses, people may decide, oh, I don't want to live in the city anymore. I don't want to commute in. Let me do my work remotely. And I think that could put a downward pressure on commercial real estate. Similarly, by the way, as if it does, and people do more work at home, people are going to demand more home space. People are going to need separate offices in their own either apartment or house. And as a result, the demand for residential real estate could well go up, even as the demand for commercial real estate goes down.
So I have 6 more questions and it's 5:46. I think that what I would like to do before posing those 6 questions is give you a 3-minute warning for any new questions, right? So that we don't sit here forever. So I have a question here from Taylor Scott. I would like to ask, what are the main economic vulnerabilities the COVID pandemic has highlighted in the US economy? And if there have been any unexpected economic outcomes of the pandemic?
Well, I think the whole thing has been unexpected. I mean, there are people who have been worrying about pandemics. I mean, there was, Bill Gates has been talking about a pandemic risk for a long time. My understanding is that the Obama administration actually had a playbook on how to deal with a pandemic, which unfortunately the Trump administration didn't pay as much attention to as they might have. There was sort of a playbook on how to deal with a pandemic. So I think the nature of this recession has by itself been unexpected. And in some sense, the one thing that's so unusual about this recession is it's really, in some ways, it's a recession by design. And by that, I mean, normally recessions happen unexpectedly. We try to get people back to work as quickly as possible. When this pandemic occurred starting in March, say April, we actually asked people, don't go to restaurants, don't go to the store. It was like policymakers were saying, we want a recession. Given the circumstances we face, a recession is the best we can do. So we designed a recession. I mean, we hadn't really ever done that before, where we basically asked people to enter recession phase. So I think that was, very unexpected. Whether they'll ever deal with one of these again, I don't know. And I think we'll be learning more things about how what are the best tools to get through this going forward.
From Barry, what is your view of the long-term future of the Chinese economy?
There's a great book called Capitalism Alone by Branko Milanovic, who was a former chief economist of the World Bank, or chief of research at World Bank. I don't remember the exact title. He's formerly from the World Bank, and he wrote this book recently, just maybe a year ago now, so before the pandemic, but not long before, called Capitalism Alone. And a large part of that book is contrasting the US system to the Chinese system. And the title of the book refers to the fact he views both systems as fundamentally capitalist. He's saying the reason China's grown very rapidly is they moved from central planning to a capitalist system. So basically, so the title refers to the fact that basically the whole world now is going capitalist. But there's very big differences between Western style capitalism, like in the United States and Western Europe, which is capitalism combined with democratic governments and a lot of personal freedoms, versus the authoritarian style capitalism that we're seeing in China, which is basically run by an non-democratic central party with a high degree of corruption. And so he's comparing those sort of two models, and a lot of the rest of the world may be looking to the West versus the authoritarian style capitalism in China, saying, which do we want to emulate? If we're a developing country, we want to follow the Chinese model and follow the American model. And so the elites in a developed country maybe is looking at this and actually wondering, because China's been growing very rapidly the past 20 years. It really has been a big success story. It convinces you that you don't have to combine capitalism with democracy. There's some people who are suggesting that growth will eventually lead to democracy. Maybe it'll lead to more freedoms in China, but there hasn't been that much pressure to leave a lot of freedoms in China so far. So maybe you don't. Now, if you're an elite in a developing country right now, looking at the dysfunction in American politics, and the same thing in the UK politics. I mean, looking at authoritarian decisions in China, you might say, this authoritarian style system actually looks like a little more attractive. Yeah, it's not democratic, but if you want to control a pandemic, it seems like work a little better. if you don't want complete polarization of your leaders, the authoritarian system looks a little better. So you can sort of see how some people might be tempted away from democracies and the freedoms that we experience in the United States. I hope that's not true, because I think in the long run, I'd personally rather live in a Western style capitalist system than an authoritarian style capitalist system. But you can see how an objective observer might come to a different conclusion at this particular moment in history.
I have two questions from Matthew Adarichev. I'm going to ask them separately because they're very different from each other. First of all, thank you very much for presenting today, Professor Mankiw. I wanted to ask you two questions. First, about Medicare for All, the American version of single-payer healthcare. Ever since candidate Bernie Sanders pioneered the policy in 2016, Medicare for All has grown immensely in popularity. From an economist's perspective, is Medicare for All feasible? Does Bernie's idea make sense? And would Medicare for All be better than our current system of mandated private insurance?
It's certainly feasible because it's very similar to what many countries have. So you can look at a lot of European countries, and they don't call it Medicare for All, but it's basically a government-run system. It can save money. It can save money in ways that aren't necessarily desirable. I mean, if you have one buyer, which is like a monopsony, buying everything, you've got to set prices. You have to set, if you look at the wages of doctors in many European countries, they're way below the wages of doctors here. If you look at what they pay for prescription drugs, they're way below what they pay for prescription drugs here. I'm not sure that's necessarily desirable. I'm not sure if you want the best people in the world to go into medicine, then depressing wages well below the current levels might not do that. If you want medical innovation like new pharmaceuticals, putting price controls on pharmaceuticals is not the way to do that. So I'm skeptical that I think Medicare for All could work and it could save money, but I'm also afraid of some other effects. I think actually one of the biggest advances in sort of human welfare over the past half century has been advances in medical technology. And the United States is a driver of advances in medical technology. Part of it's through government, like things like the NIH, but part of it's through pharmaceutical companies that are driven by the profit motive. And if they think, oh, if we invent a great new drug, they'll set price controls on it, we won't make much of a profit, they'll invest less. And that's just pretty basic economics. So I'm skeptical of too much government control of the healthcare system, even though I think it could work, because we see it working other places, and it would save money. I just feel afraid the long run consequences would not be positive.
And Matthew Marichev's second question is, in your opinion, how well does the stock market represent how well the average American citizen is doing?
Oh, I think it's correlated with it, but imperfectly correlated with it. In fact, I looked at the correlation recently of GDP growth and the stock returns, and it's in the ballpark of 0.4, 0.5. So yes, other things equal, when the stock market goes up, that's probably going to be good news for the economy, but it's not. But it's far from perfect. I mean, there's a famous quip from Paul Samuelson who said the stock market has predicted 9 of the past 5 recessions, and that's right. Stock market is very volatile. Some of the forces that drive the stock market do not affect the real economy, but some of the forces that affect the stock market do. And so yes, it's an indicator. And it's in the standard index of leading indicators that the Conference Board runs. It's one of, I think, 10 time series that they aggregate together that come up with their index of leading indicators. But it's far from. It's certainly true when people say the stock market's not the real economy. It's not the economy. It's not the Main Street economy. People are absolutely right. But I would also caution people who think they're completely disconnected.
I have a question of our colleague, Professor Mina Bose from Political Science, and also heading the Kalikoff Center for the Study of the American Presidency. What, if anything, should the federal government do to assist workers in declining fields of work, for example, movie theaters, and to develop skills to pursue other jobs?
Well, my sense, I mean, there's some government programs in training new skills. My sense is they're not all that effective. I think, I mean, one of the advantages of universal basic income is if you do sort of lose your job in some area, it gives you at least a backstop that you don't feel like, oh my God, I have no income at all while I get ready for my next job. So I think something like a universal basic income does give people breathing room to get ready. It doesn't make people whole at all. And we probably should make people always want to make sure to incentivize people to get ready for the next job, but it does prevent people from falling into very deep poverty. So, I mean, to give you another example, besides movie theaters, I think it's probably only a matter of years before we have driverless cars and driverless trucks. Think of all the, I think it's several million people who basically make their money by driving around trucks and cars. Think of taxi drivers, Uber drivers, truck drivers. If all that's basically replaced by software, which could well be the case in the next 20 years, there's going to be several million people who are going to be out of work. So suppose you imagine you're a truck driver making $50,000 a year. Universal basic income is going to stop. That $50,000 a year is going to zero. It'll go to, but it's still going to go to like $12,000 a year if you take the numbers that Andrew Yang recommended. So that's still the big hit. They're going to take a big hit. So what are we going to take? How are we going to help that 50-year-old truck driver transition to some other line of work? It's going to be a tricky thing. And trying to figure out what other line of work. In the future, my guess is that growth industries are going to be more like service-based industries, things where automation are not going to be as easy. But you're not going to turn a 50-year-old truck driver into a home healthcare worker overnight. It's just not going to. That's just not going to happen. But over the course of a generation or two, it will.
So I have the last question here from Professor Grant Saff, who heads the Department for Geography and Global Studies at Hofstra. You have argued that tax cuts, together with decreasing immigration, played a role in decreasing inequality. What role do you think that higher minimum wages in certain states have played in that regard?
That's a good question. I haven't seen evidence that explain that the minimum wage might do that. It might be partly responsible for that. There hasn't been a federal increase, but there have been some state increases. I haven't seen any evidence. My own view about the minimum wage, as long as the topic comes up, is that it's a mixed bag. It benefits some people when you have a higher minimum wage, but hurts other people because I think the demand curve for labor is downward sloping, so it has some disemployment effects. I think I could see balancing those and to deciding whether we want a higher minimum wage if we didn't have any other tools available. But I think we do have other tools available. I mean, I mentioned earlier the universal basic income, but even within the tools that are already being used, I think the earned income tax credit is a more effective tool than the minimum wage to help the same group of people. If you're aiming at helping low-wage workers, the earned income tax credit is going to be more effective because it's going to also raise their incomes after tax, but do so in a way that does not cause the disemployment effects that a higher minimum wage does. I think one of the reasons why you tend to have politicians talk about the minimum wage rather than the earned income tax credit is I don't think most people know what the earned income tax credit is. It sounds kind of complicated. It's kind of in the weeds. If you never earned the earned income tax credit, you probably don't even know. It sounds complicated. Whereas everybody kind of knows what the minimum wage is. It's kind of simple to explain. And so if you want to say, oh, I want to help the working poor, saying I want to raise the minimum wage just sounds better. It's a better soundbite on the campaign trail than saying let's expand the earned income tax credit. But I think the latter really is a better tool. And I think you've seen that tacitly acknowledged by some of our leaders. So both in Bill Clinton and George W. Bush's administration, you saw expansion of the earned income tax credit. I think further expansions of that, in particular people that don't have children, right? If you don't have children now, you don't get much of the EITC. But expanding the EITC to people without children would, to me, be a better policy than trying to expand the minimum wage.
So I think I've given you all the questions from the people participating here. And so I think it's perfectly timed because it's 5:59. And so
well, thank you. They were great questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
for also giving us great answers. Right? Very well balanced.
Let me take this opportunity to rejoin the conversation. Thank all of our participants for joining us tonight. Thank especially our featured guest, Dr. Mankiw from Harvard University, Dr. Alexandrakis for posing really interesting and thoughtful questions for all of us to ponder along with Dr. Mankiw. And thanks to Dr. Gutman for moderating the questions in the chat. For those of you who see the chat, just want to point out that we have a major Calico School event on Monday about the Peter S. Calico School poll, the state of the presidential race in fall 2020. For those of you who want a sneak peek at what that poll's going to say, I've heard that it might be in Newsday tomorrow. So you could look at Newsday and see what's going on. So thank you once again, everyone, for attending our event. Please join us on Monday. Yes, Dr. Bose confirms that there will be a sneak peek in Newsday tomorrow for the Calico poll, and it will be discussed on Monday. You can find it and find the event and register to participate at events.hofstra.edu. And please be on the lookout for exciting news about future Sutherland lecturers at Hofstra University for the spring 2021 semester. Thank you, everyone, and good night.